The morning began with quiet calm, the kind of calm that stretched across the lake and through the trees, broken only by the faint chirp of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. The man stirred in his bed, the smell of wood and hay still clinging faintly to his clothes from the work he had done the day before. His barn had always been the center of his small property, a place that wasn't just walls and timber, but something more. It held the tools he used to work the land, the hay that fed his animals, the old plough his father had once pulled across the fields, and 100 memories that lingered in every corner. But this morning the air carried something different, something heavy, something sharp. He woke not to peace but to shouting, to hurried voices rising outside his window. He sat up quickly, his chest tightening, and then he smelled it, smoke. It wasn't the gentle smoke of a fireplace or the faint trace of burning leaves. This was thick, bitter, choking. He pulled on his boots and pushed open the door, stepping out into a sky streaked with gray and orange. The shouts grew louder. His neighbors stood at the edge of their yards, pointing, their faces pale with horror. And then he saw it. The barn, his barn, was in flames. The roof glowed with fire, flames racing up the beams like hungry beasts. Smoke billowed upward, curling high into the sky, blotting out the calm morning light. The man froze, his chest heavy, his fists clenching at his sides. The barn that had stood for decades, through storms, through winters, through everything life had thrown at his family, was now turning into ash before his eyes. The heat rolled across the yard, the sound of wood cracking and splintering echoing in the air. The animals had been led out, their frightened cries filling the space as neighbors tried to hold them back. Mothers covered their children's eyes, fathers shook their heads helplessly, no one daring to step forward against the fury of the flames. And at the far edge of the crowd, just where the smoke curled around the line of trees, stood the faces that did not match the fear and shock of the rest. The HOA leaders stood together, their clothes neat, their arms crossed, their smiles thin and smug. Richard Cole, the president, had his chin lifted high, his lips twisted in satisfaction as the fire ate away at the barn. Beside him Davis muttered something under his breath that made them chuckle darkly. Linda, the treasurer, smirked as if this were nothing more than justice being carried out. They watched the fire not as victims, not as bystanders, but as judges overseeing punishment. The neighbors glanced at them nervously, some realizing what this meant, but no one said it aloud. No one dared. The man stood at the edge of the flames, his boots on the dirt, his eyes fixed on the burning barn. To anyone watching, he looked like a man broken, a man stripped of everything. His barn was more than wood. It was his livelihood. His tools, his hay, his history, it was all there. Yet as the roof caved in with a deafening crash, sending sparks flying into the air like fireworks, the man did not cry out. He did not fall to his knees. He did not shout at the sky or at the ones smirking in the distance. He stood still, silent, his face calm in a way that made even the bravest neighbor uneasy. "Why isn't he doing anything?" one whispered. That barn was everything to him. Another shook his head. Maybe he's in shock. But the truth was stranger. His silence was not weakness. It was something deeper, heavier, something that no one else understood yet. The flames raged higher, black smoke rolling over the fields, the stench of burning hay and timber filling the air until it stung the eyes and throat. The man's gaze followed the fire as it consumed the last standing beam of the barn, the wooden structure groaning like a dying animal before it collapsed into the blaze. The sound echoed through the yard, final, merciless. A hush fell over the crowd. Even the children stopped crying, their eyes wide as they watched the barn turn into a skeleton of glowing coals. The fire crackled and hissed, each pop of breaking would a cruel reminder of what had been lost. At the edge of the smoke, Richard Cole stepped forward, his voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "That's what happens," he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. "Rules are rules. You don't follow them, you pay the price." His words struck the air like knives, slicing through the silence. Some neighbors looked away, ashamed but too afraid to speak. Others nodded quickly, eager not to draw attention. Only the man stood unflinching, his eyes locked on the fire, his face unreadable. Richard smirked, mistaking silence for defeat. He thought his little barn made him untouchable. Now look at him. Nothing left. The board members chuckled softly, their laughter blending with the crackle of flames. But deep inside the man's chest, something stirred. Not rage. Not despair. Something colder. Something sharper. He thought of the barn, of the nights spent repairing its roof with his father, of the afternoons stacking hay bales with his neighbors, of the sound of rain hitting its tin roof in storms. Those memories burned with the wood, but not all was lost. He still had something they didn't know about, something they couldn't see, something they couldn't control. His silence was not surrender. It was a promise. The fire raged on until the barn was nothing more than glowing embers, a pile of ash where his history had stood. The neighbors began to drift away, shaking their heads, whispering. Some glanced back at him, pity in their eyes, confusion in their voices. He should be broken, one muttered. But he just stands there. The HOA leaders walked away slowly, their arrogance heavy in each step, their laughter faint but cruel as it faded into the distance. The man remained, his eyes on the smoke rising into the sky, his hands resting calmly at his sides. The barn was gone. The barn was ashes. But the fire had not broken him. It had lit something far stronger. He turned slowly, walking back to his house. His boots crunched on the dirt, steady, deliberate. Inside his kitchen, he poured a glass of water, sat at his table, and stared out the window at the smoke curling above the lake. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, eyes calm, jaw set. They thought they had destroyed his world. They thought the barn was everything. They thought fire was enough. They had no idea what he held, what he could unleash with a single twist, what waited at the edge of the lake where the resort's pride stood. They had burned the morning after the barn was reduced to ash. The smell of smoke still clung to the air like a curse. Blackened timbers jutted from the ruin like the bones of a fallen giant. The neighbors passed by quietly, some shaking their heads in pity, others muttering in fear, none daring to linger too long. For many, the barn's destruction was a warning. They understood what it meant. If the HOA could take down something as old and important as that, then nothing in the neighborhood was truly safe. Children stared wide-eyed at the pile of char and ash, asking their parents why the fire happened. But the parents only hushed them and walked faster. Fear traveled faster than smoke. By noon, a knock came at the man's door. It was not the polite knock of a visitor. It was sharp, heavy, meant to intimidate. When he opened it, there stood Richard Cole, the HOA president, dressed neatly in his pressed shirt and expensive watch, a smug smirk carved into his face. Behind him stood Davis and Linda, the other board members, each carrying papers in their hands. Richard held out an envelope as though presenting a gift, though his tone was nothing but poison. "Violation notice," he said coldly. "Your barn was an unapproved structure. You've been fined accordingly." The man took the envelope without a word, opening it slowly. Inside was a list of so-called violations, each one more absurd than the last. Unsafe structure. Unauthorized construction. Fire hazard. The total fine was written in bold at the bottom, $50,000. His eyes scanned the paper, steady and calm, as if reading the weather report instead of a life-altering threat. Richard watched him closely, waiting for anger, for shouting, for desperate protest. But the man only folded the paper neatly and set it aside on the small table near the door. His silence unnerved them. Richard's smirk wavered before he puffed out his chest. "You see, this is how it works. Rules are rules. You broke them, and this," he gestured toward the smoldering ruin in the distance, "is the consequence. If you don't pay, we'll take further action. Liens. Foreclosure. You'll lose everything." Davis chuckled darkly. Maybe next time he'll think twice before ignoring the board. Linda crossed her arms, her lips curling into a sneer. "We've let him get away with too much for too long. It's about time he learns the HOA always wins." The neighbors had begun to gather again, drawn by the confrontation. They whispered among themselves, their voices low, their faces uneasy. Some pitied the man, others silently agreed with the board out of fear of being next. Children clung to their parents' legs, sensing the tension. Richard turned to the crowd, raising his voice so all could hear. "Let this be an example," he declared. "No one is above the rules. If you try to defy the HOA, if you try to ignore us, this is what happens. His barn is gone, his fines will bury him, and if he doesn't pay, he'll be out of here for good. That's how we keep order." Nervous laughter rose from the board members, but the crowd stayed quiet. Many lowered their eyes, ashamed, unwilling to meet the man's gaze. Richard mistook their silence for agreement. He smirked again, relishing the moment. But the man, standing in the doorway, never flinched. His expression remained calm, his eyes steady, his breathing slow. He looked at Richard for a long moment, then simply said, "Are you finished?" The words were soft, almost too soft, but the tone behind them carried a weight that made Richard blink. For a flicker of a second, his confidence cracked. He cleared his throat, stepped back, and waved a dismissive hand. "You have a week," he snapped, before turning on his heel and striding away, Davis and Linda following close behind. Their laughter carried faintly as they disappeared down the street. The neighbors lingered for a moment longer, their whispers sharp. "He's done for," one said. "The HOA will crush him." Another shook her head. "He didn't even fight back. He just stood there. What's wrong with him?" The man closed the door quietly, shutting out their voices. Inside, he sat at his table and placed the letter beside the charred smell that seeped through his window. He did not pace, he did not rant, he did not crumble. He poured himself a glass of water, took a slow sip, and then pulled open a drawer. Inside were documents, old papers, maps of the land, technical records his father had once kept. He spread them out carefully, his hands moving with precision. There it was, the blueprint of the resort lake, the details of the dam, the valve system his family had helped design decades ago. Few people even knew the valve existed, hidden deep within the system, but he did. And unlike the HOA, who thought money and threats were the only weapons, he held something far greater, control. He traced his finger across the paper, stopping at the mark that represented the valve. His face remained calm, but deep inside, something sharp gleamed. They thought destroying the barn would break him. They thought fines and threats would bury him. They thought silence meant defeat. They didn't know that silence was his shield, his patience his blade. Outside, the neighbors gossiped about his quietness, about how strange it was that he hadn't shouted or wept. The HOA celebrated their cruelty, laughing in their boardroom about their victory. But as night fell, the man sat by the window, staring out at the lake that reflected the stars. The valve was there, waiting, a secret only he controlled. He whispered to himself, his voice steady. "They burned wood and stone. They think it's over. But they've only given me reason to turn." The night was quiet, the lake resting under the pale glow of the moon. The stars stretched across the sky like 1,000 watchful eyes, but the man's gaze was fixed on the black surface of the water. He stood at the edge of the property, his hands in his pockets, the faint smell of smoke still drifting from the ruins of his barn behind him. Neighbors had gone inside, the board members were surely sleeping soundly in their big houses, smug in their false victory, but he remained outside, silent and thoughtful. His barn was gone, burned to ash, but in his heart he knew they had only struck at the surface. They thought fire had taken everything. They didn't know what rested beneath the calm waters of the lake. His boots crunched on gravel as he walked along the shore, the moonlight glinting faintly on metal just ahead. It was half hidden by weeds, rust coating the edges, forgotten by everyone except him. He crouched down, running his hand over the cold steel of the valve. It was large, heavy, and old, the kind of thing that took real strength to move, but his fingers brushed it with a familiarity born from years of memory. His father had shown it to him when he was young, back when the lake was not yet a resort but just another water project. His father had worked with the engineers who built the dam and the pipes that fed the water through. The valve was the heart of it, a single twist controlling the flow of millions of gallons. Over time, the lake had grown into something else. Developers had built expensive cabins along its edges, boardwalks, and docks. The HOA had turned it into their golden jewel, their $5 million resort lake that brought in prestige and money. They boasted about it at every meeting, bragged about how they controlled the lake, how they owned the water. But they were wrong. They controlled the surface, the image, the money. They never knew the truth, that buried beneath the ground, hidden in plain sight, one valve could drain it all. And he was the only one who knew where it was and how it worked. He stood there for a long time, his hand resting on the cold wheel, his mind moving back to memories of his father's voice. Control isn't about shouting, his father had once said. It's about knowing where to place your hand. One turn in the right place can do more than 100 words. That lesson had stayed with him his whole life, and now it pulsed inside him like the beat of his heart. The HOA thought they had broken him, but all they had done was remind him of the power he held. His silence wasn't weakness. It was waiting. From the distance, the clubhouse lights twinkled on the far shore of the lake, laughter faintly echoing through the night. The board was celebrating, convinced they had ended him with their fire and their fines. They had no idea their precious jewel sat on top of a weapon they could not see. He looked at the dark water, imagining it receding, the docks tipping, the boats stuck in mud, the luxury resort turned into a cracked, empty basin. He imagined Richard's smug face when the truth dawned on him, the panic in Linda's eyes, the desperation in Davis's voice. He imagined the whole neighborhood watching as the HOA's pride drained away not in years, not in weeks, but in hours. He stood, straightening his back, his expression unreadable in the silver light. He whispered softly, his voice carried away by the breeze. They destroyed my barn. They think they've taken everything. But they've only reminded me what I can take from them. His hand tightened briefly on the valve before he stepped away. He did not turn it yet. Timing mattered. Patience mattered. He would let them grow more arrogant. Let them believe they had one. Let them laugh until their throats were sore. And then, when they least expected it, he would twist the steel, and the water they worshipped would vanish into the earth. Back at his house, he sat once more at his table, papers spread out before him. The fine notice, the photographs of his barn reduced to ash, and beside them, the old maps his father had left him showing the hidden water system. He placed his hand on the map where the valve was marked with a simple black X. His eyes narrowed, his jaw set. The HOA had destroyed wood and stone, but he held something far more powerful, control over the very lifeblood of their empire. Outside, the lake lay calm and beautiful under the night sky. To the HOA it was a symbol of their strength, the crown of their rule. But to him, it was nothing more than a reservoir waiting to be emptied. The clubhouse glowed like a lantern in the night, its tall windows spilling golden light onto the quiet street outside. Cars lined the driveway, expensive ones, each polished to shine as if their owners had something to prove. Inside, the air buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, and the sound of self-congratulation. The HOA board had gathered their friends and supporters for what they proudly called a celebration of order. Richard Cole stood near the head of the room, dressed in a dark suit, his glass of wine raised high as though he were a king in his hall. His smug smile never left his face as he welcomed each guest with exaggerated cheer. Davis leaned against the bar, chuckling loudly, his voice carrying over the music. Did you see his face when the barn burned? He didn't say a word. Not even a shout. Broken. Completely broken. Linda, standing beside him, smirked, swirling her drink. And he should be. That barn was everything to him. Now it's gone, and soon his land will be too. Once those fines stack up, he'll have no choice but to hand it over. Another victory for the board. Their laughter blended with the chatter of others, some uneasy but too afraid to say a word. Many of the neighbors had been forced to attend, their invitations not requests but demands. They sat at tables, sipping drinks quietly, their eyes avoiding Richard's, clapping when told but never smiling with their hearts. They knew this was not a celebration. It was a show of power, a reminder of who controlled the neighborhood. Richard raised his glass again, his voice booming. This is what happens when someone thinks they can defy the HOA. They lose. Always. Order must be protected, and we are the protectors. Applause followed, though thin and nervous. The guests looked at each other, knowing the truth but unwilling to voice it. They had seen the barn burn. They had seen the smug faces of the board at the fire. But fear was stronger than anger, at least for now. At the back of the room, half hidden in the shadows, stood the man. He had walked in quietly, no one noticing at first. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his expression calm. He said nothing, and yet his presence was felt like a weight pressing against the laughter. His eyes scanned the room, every word, every boast, every smirk sinking into his memory. He watched Richard toast his own power, watched Davis boast about controlling fear, watched Linda smirk as if she were untouchable. They thought he was defeated, a broken man watching his own humiliation, but in truth he was measuring them, letting them reveal their arrogance, their greed, their weakness. Richard spotted him at last, and for a moment his smile faltered. But quickly he forced it back, raising his voice louder, as if to cover his unease. "Ah, even our quiet neighbor joins us. See, even he knows resistance is pointless. He can stand there and sulk all he wants, but his fate is already sealed." Laughter rose again, but it was thinner now, cracks showing in the performance. The man did not react. He did not flinch. He simply remained where he was, his calm gaze locked on Richard until the president looked away, rattled by the silence. The rest of the evening carried on with food and drink, with the board bragging about new projects and future fines, with their arrogance swelling like the music that filled the room. But beneath the laughter, tension brewed. The neighbors saw the man standing still, saw the way he never moved, never lowered his eyes. They whispered among themselves, confusion mixing with curiosity. "Why is he here?" one asked quietly. "Why does he just stand there?" another murmured. "Maybe he's planning something," came the nervous reply. As the night stretched on, Richard grew louder, drunk on both wine and power. "This neighborhood is ours," he declared, his voice ringing through the hall. "No one can stand against us. We built this place, we run this place, and anyone who forgets that will burn like his barn did." The words sent a shiver through the room. Even some of the loyalists exchanged uneasy glances. The man turned then, walking slowly toward the door. Heads followed him as he moved, but he did not rush. Each step was steady, deliberate, silent. He left without a word, closing the door softly behind him, but his absence filled the room with something heavier than his presence had. The laughter did not return so easily after he left. Outside, the night air was cool and still. He walked along the edge of the lake, the faint sound of the party echoing behind him. His eyes moved to the water, calm and dark under the stars, hiding the secret that no one else remembered. He thought of the valve, of the power resting quietly beneath their arrogance, and his jaw tightened. The board thought they had won, thought their fire had broken him, thought their celebration proved their strength. They did not realize that every cheer tonight was another nail in their coffin. They did not realize the silence they mocked was the silence of a storm waiting to strike. He stopped at the shoreline, staring across at the clubhouse lights, his reflection dark in the water. His voice was low, carried away by the wind. "Celebrate while you can. Soon, your pride will drown in the mud." And with that, he turned and walked back toward his home, the faint smell of smoke from the barn still lingering in the night air, mixing with the quiet promise of what was to come. The night was darker than usual, the moon hidden behind heavy clouds, the air still as if the world itself was waiting for something. The man moved quietly, his boots steady on the dirt path that led to the dam at the far end of the lake. No one followed him. No one knew where he was going. Behind him, faint music still carried from the clubhouse, where the board continued their celebration late into the night, drunk on wine and arrogance. Their laughter floated across the water like echoes of fools who thought themselves kings. But here at the dam, the only sound was the soft rush of water beneath the earth, hidden and powerful. He reached the old steel valve, half buried in weeds, its surface slick with rust and age. He crouched down, brushing the dirt from its edges with his hand, his touch familiar. He remembered standing here as a boy, his father's rough hand on his shoulder, explaining how the system worked. "This lake is only as strong as this wheel," his father had said. Turn it, and everything changes. Those words returned now, heavy with meaning. The HOA thought they owned the lake, thought their resort was untouchable, thought money and rules made them invincible. They had no idea that all their power rested on this one hidden piece of iron, waiting for the right hand to use it. The man placed both hands on the valve and gripped it tightly. It groaned under his weight, resisting at first, the rust clinging stubbornly as though it had forgotten its purpose. He pushed harder, his muscles straining, his breath steady. Slowly, painfully, the wheel began to move. 1 inch, then 2. A low rumble echoed from deep within the ground, the sound of ancient pipes waking from their slumber. He pushed again, the valve creaking, the rumble growing louder, deeper, like thunder rolling beneath the earth. Then it happened. A rush of water burst through the underground channels, surging forward with unstoppable force. The sound roared into the night, a deep growl that shook the silence. At first, the lake's surface seemed unchanged, the calm water reflecting the faint glow of the clubhouse lights. But within minutes, the shoreline began to shift. The water pulled back, subtle at first, then faster, leaving damps and exposed where the shore had once been. Docks tilted as their posts sank into mud, boats rocked violently, ropes straining as the water that held them slipped away. At the resort, late-night guests noticed the change. One man shouted, pointing at the shrinking shoreline. Another screamed when their boat crashed onto the mud with a hollow thud. Panic rippled through the night air as more voices joined, their laughter turning into fear. The board members stumbled out of the clubhouse, still half-drunk, their smiles gone. Richard's voice was sharp with confusion. What's happening? Why is the water dropping? Davis stared in disbelief. It's draining too fast. This isn't natural. Linda fumbled with her phone, calling contractors, engineers, anyone who would listen. But no one could stop it now. The lake was bleeding, pouring itself out through the channels, rushing into the earth like a beast finally freed. The man stood at the edge of the dam, his arms crossed, his face calm as the chaos began. He watched the water slide away, the proud docks left hanging in the air, the luxury boats stranded in the muck. The once mighty jewel of the HOA was crumbling before their eyes, not in weeks or months but in hours, undone by a single twist of his hand. Richard stumbled toward the dam, his eyes wide, his face pale. He shouted across the distance, his voice hoarse with panic. Did you do this? Stop it. You'll destroy everything. The man did not answer. He simply watched as the water continued to vanish, his silence heavier than any words. Neighbors gathered now, woken by the noise, their eyes wide as they saw the impossible happening before them. Some gasped, others whispered in awe. The lake, it's draining, one cried. How is this happening? Another asked. No one answered, but all of them noticed the man standing calmly by the dam, his posture steady, his eyes locked on the crumbling empire of the HOA. By dawn, the once glorious lake was half its size. Fish flopped helplessly in the shallows, boats sat crooked in the mud, and the air stank of wet earth. The board members raged and panicked, shouting orders that no one followed, their arrogance melting into desperation. But the man said nothing. He turned from the valve, leaving it wide open, the roar of the draining water filling the morning air. His boots carried him back to his house, step by steady step, while behind him the HOA's jewel collapsed into ruin. They had burned his barn, thinking they had broken him. They had laughed in their clubhouse, certain of victory. But now, with one turn of a hidden valve, he had taken everything from them. Their pride, their wealth, their control, all sinking into the mud, never to return. Morning light broke over the neighborhood, but it was not the same calm dawn people were used to. Instead of sunlight dancing peacefully on the lake, there was chaos. The once proud waterline had sunk drastically, docks now leaned awkwardly into the air, boats lay tilted in thick mud, and the smell of wet earth filled the breeze. Families gathered at the shore, their voices filled with disbelief. Where's the water going? One shouted. Look at the docks, another cried. Children pointed at fish wriggling helplessly in the shallow muck, their laughter mixing with the shock of something they couldn't understand. The HOA board members rushed to the scene, their expensive shoes sinking into the damp ground, their faces pale. Richard Cole barked orders into his phone, his voice cracking as he shouted for contractors. Engineers, anyone who might fix the disaster. Get pumps here now. Get the county. Do something. But his words carried no weight anymore. No one obeyed. Davis stood beside him, clutching his head, his eyes wild. This isn't possible, he muttered. Lakes don't just vanish overnight. Someone did this. His gaze drifted toward the dam, where the man had been seen last night by a few watchful neighbors. Linda, the treasurer, scrolled frantically on her phone, her fingers shaking. The accounts are already frozen. We don't have the funds to fix this. Do you hear me, Richard? Even if someone could stop it, we can't pay them. We're finished. Her voice cracked on the last word, drawing stares from the crowd. The homeowners, who had once cowered at the board's power, were now murmuring openly, their whispers rising into angry shouts. They let this happen. They wasted our money. They destroyed his barn, and now look at their lake. The man appeared at the edge of the crowd, calm as always, his boots carrying him slowly down the path toward the drained shoreline. He said nothing, but his presence made the whispers louder, sharper. All eyes turned to him, as if everyone suddenly understood. He didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood with his arms crossed, watching the lake recede further, watching the HOA scramble like rats trying to hold back a flood. Richard's eyes locked on him, rage twisting his features. You, he shouted, his voice hoarse. This is your doing. You've destroyed everything. You'll pay for this. His words hung in the air, but no one clapped, no one nodded. The crowd stayed silent, their eyes shifting from Richard to the man, from the desperate president to the calm figure who had never once broken. The silence was heavier than any cheer, and Richard felt it pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't lift. Davis tried to regain control, waving his hands. Listen, everyone. The HOA will fix this. We'll handle it. But his voice cracked, his promises empty. Everyone knew the truth now. The HOA wasn't in control anymore. Their empire was crumbling, their pride draining away with every gallon of water that rushed through the open channels. By noon, the lake was nearly gone. The grand docks stood on dry land, boats tipped over like toys in the mud. The resort cabins, once advertised as lakefront luxury, now overlooked a barren wasteland. The jewel of the HOA had turned into a scar, and nothing could hide it. News spread fast. Photos taken by neighbors filled social media. Reporters began to arrive, and whispers of investigations grew louder. Some homeowners approached the man, their voices hushed but grateful. You did this, didn't you? One asked softly. He didn't answer, but the faintest trace of a smile touched his lips, enough to confirm what they already believed. The board, meanwhile, had collapsed into panic. Linda wept openly, her phone slipping from her hand as calls went unanswered. Davis paced frantically, muttering about lawsuits and jail. Richard stood frozen, his suit stained with mud, his eyes locked on the man who had not said a single word but had destroyed them more completely than any fire could. You think you've won? Richard spat, his voice shaking. You'll regret this. You'll. But his words faltered as neighbors turned their backs on him, their faces filled not with fear but with contempt. 4 years, fear had been the HOA's greatest weapon. But now it was gone, replaced by something stronger. Anger. The man turned finally, his boots crunching against the damp earth as he walked away from the drained lake. He didn't need to stay. The chaos would grow without him. The HOA had been exposed, their lies laid bare, their arrogance drowned in mud. His silence had been enough to finish them. Behind him, the sound of shouting and panic rose higher, mixing with the cries of neighbors demanding answers, demanding justice. But he never looked back. His steps were steady, his shoulders straight, his face calm. The HOA had destroyed his barn, thinking it would break him. Instead, he had drained their world dry, leaving them to choke on their own downfall. Days passed, but the lake never returned. The once proud jewel of the HOA now lay as a cracked basin of mud, the smell of rotting fish thick in the air. What was once their greatest symbol of wealth and control had become a monument to arrogance, a scar the whole town could see. Reporters came with cameras, flashing lights across the ruins, their voices sharp as they demanded answers from the board. Why was the lake not maintained? Where did the money go? Why are residents accusing you of fraud? Richard Cole, who once stood tall with his suits and speeches, now stumbled under the weight of microphones and angry voices. His words, once smooth and commanding, fell apart. This is sabotage, he muttered. We'll fix it. But no one believed him anymore. The accounts Linda had hidden were exposed. Every dollar of the HOA drained not just from the lake but from the books. Davis tried to argue, but investigators pulled papers from his own office that showed false fines and illegal spending. The truth spilled out faster than the water had drained, and the community saw everything they had feared was real. Lawsuits were filed, police cars pulled up in the driveways of board members, and one by one the leaders of the HOA were taken away in handcuffs, their proud faces twisted in shock as neighbors watched. For years they had ruled with fear, but now fear was theirs alone. The man stood at the edge of the crowd when Richard was led out of his house, his hands cuffed, his head down. Their eyes met one last time, Richard's filled with hate, the man's calm and steady. Richard wanted to speak, to curse him, but the words never came. All he managed was silence as the car door shut, carrying him away forever. The neighbors began to gather then, no longer whispering in fear but talking openly, their voices filled with relief and gratitude. Some walked up to the man, patting his shoulder, thanking him quietly. "You saved us," one said. "You gave us our homes back," another added. But he only nodded, his eyes drifting back to the drained lake. He didn't smile. He didn't boast. He had never needed to. His silence was his weapon, and it had been enough. Weeks later, the sound of hammers and saws filled the air as workers arrived at his land. A new barn rose from the ashes, larger than before, its beams strong, its walls shining under the sun. Neighbors came to help, carrying wood, offering meals, lending hands. It was no longer just his fight. The community, once broken under the HOA's rule, had found strength in standing together. Children laughed again in the fields, chasing each other where fear once hung heavy. At dusk, the man stood before his new barn, his hands resting on the wooden frame, the smell of fresh cut timber filling the air. Behind him, the drained lake glimmered under the setting sun, no longer a symbol of wealth but of victory. The HOA was gone, their empire reduced to mud and memory, their arrogance punished by the very land they had tried to control. He breathed deeply, the air free of smoke, the silence no longer heavy with loss but with peace. The neighbors gathered one last time, not for fear or orders but to celebrate, their laughter warm and real. They spoke of rebuilding, of new beginnings, of finally living without chains. The man did not give a speech, he did not raise a glass, he simply stood with them, his presence enough. His fight was never for glory, it was for freedom, and now it was theirs. The barn stood tall again, the lake lay empty, and the once mighty board had vanished like water down the drain. He had no need to remind them of what had happened, no need to say a single word. Everyone remembered. Everyone knew. In the end, his silence told the story better than any voice ever could.